We are in the book of Lamentations, and Lamentations is a difficult yet important book within the biblical canon. There are so many things that we need to understand about Lamentations in order for us to go forward, and we talked about a lot of that last week, so I want to do just a quick recap to get you up to speed as to what we talked about last week. Sometime around the year 1000 BCE, there was a nation named Israel that was united by a man named Saul. They established this kingdom, and later Israel became known as Judah. Judah survived for 400 years until in 586 BCE, a superpower rose to the east known as Babylon. And Babylon launched an aggressive attack against Judah with the capital of Jerusalem. In 586, then, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed Judah, and took any remaining survivors back with them to the land of Babylon and forced them to live as Babylonians. Now, imagine living in this era. The era is known as the exile. And it's here that you can imagine that people who have believed in God their whole lives go through this traumatic experience, and they say to themselves, let's pray to God to deliver us. And so a prayer arises from the land of Babylon, and the prayer is very simple. God, show us mercy. And you can imagine this prayer being prayed with great fervor for the first day of exile, and the second day of exile, and the third day of exile. But I have to ask you, if you lived through this experience, if you lived in the exile, how many years would you exist in this exile before you started to give up hope that God would show you mercy? Would it be 1 year, 2 years, 10 years? It's important for you to answer that question because that is the inspiration behind the book of Lamentations. Because while we don't know the year that Lamentations was written, we have a very strong guess that Lamentations was written in exile in Babylon, which we know, living on this side of history, lasted for 47 years. So somewhere in that time, people started to give up that God was hearing their prayers, and they started hearing other people say, God will show us mercy, and their response was, God has not shown us any mercy. And for this reason, the book of Lamentations is often ignored by Christians today, because the thesis of Lamentations is what we talked about last week. It's that prayer doesn't work. Now, this is stunning to both you and me. I know this. It's really hard to believe this book made it in the Bible, but here it is. And if you're like me, you read the book of Lamentations and you leave with this feeling of, oh, I'm not sure this is a happy ending. My friends, reading the book of Lamentations is unsettling. And I have to tell you that when we talk about Lamentations, it will bring about discomfort because that's what these poems are designed to do. Lamentations is composed of 5 different poems. There are 5 different chapters, all containing poems that are meant to stand on their own. So we're doing a 5-part series in the book of Lamentations. And as you know, poetry is not meant to be analyzed as an end goal. It's meant to be felt. So for that reason, we are going to close our service after I've analyzed this poem with you with an expression of this lament. Now, this expression will be in the Jewish tradition of Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av takes place on the 9th of Av, and it commemorates the destruction of the temple that took place in 586 BCE, and then again in 70 CE. Now, we are going to do our best to pay honor to the Jewish tradition, and Colin George Babb will close this service by reading from Lamentations 2 in darkness, only illuminated by candlelight. Now, if this is your first time here, you will hear Colin start to read and you will think, this is nice, but how long does this go on for? Because we all have shrinking attention spans, don't we? It will last for 5 minutes. We're gonna make it, I promise. So just relax when Colin starts to read, okay? So he's gonna read Lamentations 2. I'm gonna tell you about Lamentations 2, and it's all in an effort for you to be able to feel the words of the poet that wrote 2,500 years ago. Now, let's talk about Lamentations 2. One of my favorite commentaries online is a group called the Bible Project. You can find their commentaries on YouTube, and I have found that they do really excellent work in summarizing the books of the Bible and talking about what those books mean. In their commentary on Lamentations 2, they tell you that Lamentations 2 is about how God is slow to anger, but God will judge human evil. And when you look closely at Lamentations 2, you think to yourself, okay, I can get my head around this. This makes sense. Yes, God does have patience, but that patience only lasts for so long before God has to enact some punishment. So I had in my mind a sermon that I would write that would match these words. And then I read Lamentations 2 and realized that the Bible Project, which is a group of people I love and have used frequently, I think they missed the mark on this one. Because Lamentations 2 is wild. And to describe how wild it is, we're going to talk about the 5 movements that take place in this poem. The first moment takes place in the first few verses of the poem. We read, "Alas, the Lord has covered daughter Zion with God's anger." Now, if you lived through this experience, you may say to yourself, wow, this exile was horrible. God must be angry with us. What other explanation could we possibly have about why we are here in exile? So we read, "The Lord has covered daughter Zion with God's anger. God has thrown down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. God did not protect God's temple when God displayed God's anger." Now the temple was in Jerusalem, and there was this theological idea that because this temple had been erected, it would never fall, because this was God's own sacred house. So God would do whatever it took to protect the house. But then 586 happened, the Babylonians come in, and they conquer Jerusalem, and they destroy the temple. Now, this is a theologically traumatic experience, but the way that theologians explained it while they were in exile, looking back at this destruction, is they said, wow, God went into a blinded rage. And God's rage was so out of control, it was to the point where God inflicted self-harm. God destroyed God's own house. Not only that, but you have to remember that there's this constant prayer for mercy that's occurring. And the author of Lamentations 2 addresses that and says, "The Lord destroyed mercilessly all the homes of Jacob's descendants. In God's anger, God tore down the fortified cities of daughter Judah. God knocked to the ground and humiliated the kingdom and its rulers. In fierce anger, lost my place. In fierce anger, God destroyed the whole army of Israel. God withdrew God's right hand as the enemy attacked. God was like a raging fire in the land of Jacob. It consumes everything around it." So the author of Lamentations wants the reader to know that God was out of control in the first movement. The second movement then shifts gears to a rather surprising conclusion. The author says that God prepared God's bow like an enemy. Now, it's a pretty bold thing to describe God as the enemy of Judah, right? Especially when you consider that Christians love art pieces like this one. Christians go nuts for these kind of art pieces, right? Where there's a cross protecting it from imminent danger. And as long as the cross is between us and the imminent danger, then we're okay. The problem is when you read Lamentations 2 and you realize that this author doesn't think that Babylon's the enemy. The author thinks that God is the enemy. So if the author of Lamentations saw this portrait, the author would say, oh, there's God. That's him, that's God doing God's thing, and that's what happened to us back in 586 BCE. So we read, God prepared God's bow like an enemy. God's right hand was ready to shoot. The poet doesn't want to let go this idea that God is opposed to Judah. So the author continues, like a foe, God killed everyone, even our strong young men. God has poured out God's anger like fire on the tent of daughter Zion. The Lord, like an enemy, destroyed Israel. God destroyed all her palaces. God ruined her fortified cities. So here we hear in the first movement that God is out of control. Second movement, God is our enemy. The third movement is the emotional heartbeat of this poem. Because you may be tempted to hear the first two movements and calm down the poet, but then the poet would unleash this third movement and you would say, maybe you're not overreacting. Because the poet writes, my eyes are worn out from weeping, my stomach is in knots. My heart is poured out on the ground due to the destruction of my helpless people. Children and infants faint in the town squares. Children say to their mothers, "Where are food and drink?" The children faint like a wounded warrior in the city squares. And so the author, the poet, invites us to the destroyed ruins of Jerusalem. And while people would rush in with easy answers and tell the poet, "Hey, I know it's tough, but God has a plan for all this destruction," I imagine the author of Lamentations looking at that person and saying, "Don't tell me about God's plan. Do you see how devastating this destruction is?" The poet goes on, "I see these children die slowly in their mother's arms." Which brings us to the fourth movement. Here we are invited to see all of the suffering, and it is unbearable the amount of suffering the author has gone through. But in the fourth movement, it gets even worse. Because the author starts looking around at all the nations around Judah, and he realizes they are happy that Judah has been destroyed. The author writes, "All who passed by on the road clapped their hands to mock you. They sneered and shook their heads at daughter Jerusalem. 'Ha,' they said, 'is this the city that they called the perfection of beauty, the source of joy for the whole earth?' All your enemies gloated over you. They sneered and gnashed their teeth. They said, 'We have destroyed her, the city of Jerusalem. Ha! We have waited a long time for this day. We have lived to see it.'" And in this unbearable suffering, all of these neighbors come by and point and laugh and mock Jerusalem. And it's here in this fourth movement that there's one line that Christians who study this text overemphasize, in my opinion. Because this is the only line in the whole poem that appears to say something even remotely positive about God. The line is verse 17 when the author writes, "The Lord has done what the Lord has planned. God has fulfilled God's promise that God threatened long ago." So when people at the Bible Project, which is a commentary I like, remember, say to you, "Oh, this is about God fulfilling God's promise," which is, "Hey, behave and I won't have to act, but if you don't behave," I feel like this interpretation overemphasizes verse 17. And asks the reader to turn a blind eye to the suffering of children. Now, I want to emphasize again, I appreciate the Bible Project's work, but at the same time, it's always important for us to remember you should always read the Bible for yourself. Because some people will tell you it's about this, and then you read it and you say, "Oh, it's about something else entirely." And that can be found in the fifth movement, the last 3 verses of this poem. And rather than having a person speak, as the first 19 verses have done, the city of Jerusalem begins to speak. And the city of Jerusalem, remember, in its rubbled and disheveled state, cries out to God and says, "Look, O Lord, consider, whom have you ever afflicted like this? We've had it worse than anyone. Should women eat their offspring, their healthy infants?" Suggesting that it got so bad that cannibalism became the norm. "Should priest and prophet be killed in the Lord's sanctuary? The young boys and old men lie dead on the ground in the streets. My young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. You, God, killed them when you were angry. You, God, slaughtered them without mercy. As if it were a feast day, you call enemies to terrify me on every side. On the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. My enemy has finished off those healthy infants whom I bore and raised." And who is the enemy in this poem? Well, according to the poet, it's God. And when you consider that the poet believes that God is hurting the babies, murdering the babies, you realize that there is something powerful happening in this passage of Lamentations. Because Lamentations 2 is not about God fulfilling a promise. Lamentations 2 is the testimony of the city through the destruction by the Babylonian Empire. And as they do that, as we realize that, the testimony of Jerusalem is not a tame testimony. Instead, the testimony of Jerusalem is that they were betrayed by God. The city says we were betrayed. We were stabbed in the back by God. Betrayal by God happens. And if you're like me, you hear this and you say to yourself, I've got one word in my head right now: heresy. You can't tell people that God betrays humans. Humans betray God. Judas kissed Jesus. Jesus didn't kiss Judas. It's heretical. It's against the tradition. You've got to sing songs that say your love never fails. It never gives up. It never runs out on me. Those are the songs that we sing. This is what we say. You can't tell people that God betrays human. If you tell people that, that's heresy. It goes against the goodness of God. And someone could come forward and say, Craig, where did you get this idea that God betrays humans? And I would say, oh, I got it from the Bible. And what I hope that you see today, even if you disagree with me that this is what the author is saying, what I hope that you can understand and we can agree on is that we have to accept that the Bible contains a poem about God betraying human beings. And this poem is found in Lamentations 2. And there's no bailout zone. It's very raw and real, and it's asking us to look at suffering children. So when we talk about the betrayal of God, you may be saying to yourself, this is heavy. How are we going to get out of this one, Craig? How could you possibly talk about the betrayal of God in a way that is helpful and make it so that I was actually glad that I showed up here on a Saturday morning? Well, to answer that question, I want to talk about the betrayal of God using a movie that talks about the human spirit and is one of those movies that you just know is going to be deep the moment you see the cover. The movie I'm talking about is the movie Cars. Cars talks about the betrayal of God. Now, I need some help from some kids in the audience. Does any kid know who the red car is up here? Yeah. Lightning McQueen, no doubt about it. Lightning McQueen is the protagonist of this film. Does any kid know who the green car is? Right? We all forgot because the green car is the villain and the Chick Hicks, very good. The Chick Hicks is the villain of the film. Does anybody remember the blue car's name? The King. Excellent work over there. Thank you very much for helping me out. The King is an old, crusty veteran who is a racing legend, but he is on his way out of professional racing. So you got Lightning McQueen, the protagonist, Chick Hicks, the villain, and the King. Now, I have to give you a spoiler alert for a 15-year-old movie. I'm going to tell you how it ends. So, these three are racing at the end. They've raced before, but they're racing at the end. They get to the last lap. Lightning McQueen is in the lead. This obviously makes the villain very angry. And the villain, enraged, Chick Hicks, decides to sideswipe the King. It's a dirty racing move. The whole crowd goes, boo, awful, right? The King gets bumped, and the King begins to flip over and over. We see the King take a lot of damage. We see the King get beat up. This is one of those moments where people aren't sure if the King is going to survive. And Chick Hicks gets to sail on without penalty. Now, Lightning McQueen is on the last turn right before the finish line, and he hears the destruction of the King behind him, and he looks in his rearview mirror or something, and he says to himself, the King is hurt. And just inches before the finish line, Lightning McQueen slams the brakes. He would have won if he just would have gone a few more inches. Slams his brakes in fury and begins to throw it in reverse. As he's backing up, Chick Hicks zooms by and wins the Piston Cup. But Lightning McQueen goes back to the King and begins to push him. And he says, I just have this feeling that the King should finish his last race. I know, right? Pixar, right in the feels again. Chick Hicks is awarded the Piston Cup. And he gets up there and he assumes that he will be applauded and rewarded, but people begin to boo him, and they actually aim the confetti cannons at him, which seems like an OSHA violation, right? And the whole idea is that the Chick Hicks is booed while Lightning McQueen is applauded. And the moral of the story is very obvious because Disney and Pixar doesn't want your kids to miss it. There's more to life than winning. Can I get an amen? Right? It's very transparent what moral they're trying to go for. In case you missed it, they really hammer it home in the denouement of the film. Here we see Lightning McQueen, after the Piston Cup is handed out, he goes to his mentor, who he's trained for hours and hours with, and his mentor, the Hudson Hornet, says to Lightning McQueen, "You did good, kid, you did good." Then Dynaco, the rich oil industry, comes up and says, "We're gonna offer you the most lucrative race racing contract possible." And Lightning McQueen all of a sudden has an opportunity to make more money than ever before. But he turns it down, says, "I'm gonna stick with my guys." And then Dynaco says, "Well, we're not all about money. Is there anything else I can do for you?" And he says, "You can give my best friend a ride in your helicopter." And so Mater gets to take a ride in the helicopter. Yes, he's thrilled. Lightning McQueen then goes back to Radiator Springs. He sees his girlfriend. His girlfriend is so proud of him. "You did it, Lightning. You didn't win the race. You prioritized what was right." And if you're like me, you watch how this all plays out after the fact, and you realize the moral is there's more to life than winning. But then you look at Lightning McQueen's life, and you're like, isn't Lightning McQueen winning, though? I mean, he's got rich relationships. His mentor thinks he's great. He's got money, helicopter rides. It's kind of winning, isn't it? And then you realize that while there is the moral that winning isn't everything, that there's more to life than winning, there's also a very strong message being sent to kids. And the message is, kids, when you do the right thing, you will win in the end. And when you think about what Lightning McQueen does here when he stops inches from the finish line, and it is an act of faith. He believes that his life will be better if he turns around and helps the king than if he goes forward and wins the race. And he believes that this will ultimately come back and pay him in spades if he's just willing to prioritize what is right. So the message of Cars is when you do the right thing, you will win. Which is a great message, right? There's just one problem with it. Life doesn't always work out like a Disney movie, does it? Because here's this moment of faith, but let's reimagine the movie Cars for a minute, shall we? Let's imagine that Lightning McQueen slams on the brake, turns around, goes and gets the king. Instead of people applauding him, all the people who gambled on Lightning McQueen to win the race begin booing him, and he becomes the scorn and the ire of the internet. Not only that, but he returns to the Hudson Hornet, his mentor. And the mentor doesn't say, "You did good, kid." Instead, the mentor says, "Why did we train so hard if you were just going to quit at the end?" Now, because he didn't win, Dynaco doesn't offer him the sponsorship. In fact, his current sponsor, Rusty's, is like, "Hey, we know you did the right thing, but we're dropping our sponsorship with you because our brand needs to be associated with winners. We're Rusty's. We're not some chump like mom and pop shop. We're like excellence. That's all that matters." And Dynaco doesn't go to the person who didn't win the race. Dynaco ends up going to the person who wins the race, Chick Hicks, and they say, "Is there anything we can do for you?" And Chick Hicks doesn't like Lightning McQueen, so he's like, "How about you give Lightning McQueen's best friend a ride in a helicopter and tell him Chick Hicks gave it to him?" Then we close the movie as Mater is on this helicopter screaming, "Oh, Chick Hicks is my new best friend." And then Lightning McQueen goes to Sally, his girlfriend. They end up getting married. And after a few days, she all of a sudden says, we sure could have used the prize money that came with that Piston Cup. I mean, come on, Lightning, couldn't you have just crossed the finish line and then turned around and helped the king finish his race? That would have been a lot more money. Now imagine if all of that played out. The credits roll, and you would turn to your family and you would say, "This is not a kid's movie. This is not a kid's movie. This should work out for Lightning McQueen because he did the right thing. But why is it that he's not rewarded for that?" And the reason I tell you about all of this is because I believe that this is what embodies what I would define to be as a betrayal by God. In my opinion, a betrayal by God occurs when you or I decide to do what is right, but then you end up losing because of that decision. Have you ever done the right thing at work and got punished for it? Have you ever tried to mend bridges with your friends at school and they've ended up fighting you even more? Have you ever been honest with your finances and it ended up costing you more to do that? Anytime you have done the right thing and you've ended up losing because of it, I would classify that as a betrayal by God. Because when we do the right thing with no apparent advantage, we are trusting that something good will come out of this. And what's fascinating about the book of Lamentations is that Lamentations contains a poem that tells us that betrayals by God happen. They're real experiences. And if you're a person of faith, at some point, you are going to experience a betrayal. The experience of being betrayed by God is real for people of faith. I know just about everyone in this room, and I've heard stories from several of you about how you did the right thing and got punched in the face for it. What else can you describe that as other than a betrayal by God? And this poem is included in the Bible, which tries to warn you, hey, you should do the right thing, but you should know it's not always going to work out for you. Because betrayals by God are real experiences, and we need to accept them as part of our faith journeys. Now, one major problem of this, churches often function as propaganda machines, and what this means is that churches become a place where it's not okay to talk about betrayals by God. I've been through several iterations of church, and it is very rare that the book of Lamentations is talked about in person. It is very rare that the book of Lamentations is felt and read aloud. And the reason for this is because when we read Lamentations, it is an honest and unflinching movement of telling people about a witness to the time that God betrayed the people of Israel. And churches today are often built on the premise that we don't speak about God's betrayals here. We speak about God's faithfulness, but not the betrayals. And I'm not here today to tell you that we've only got to talk about betrayals, right? That would be demoralizing. But what I hope the book of Lamentations can teach you and teach me is that when we look at cars and we say, oh man, if things didn't work out for Lightning McQueen, then it wouldn't be a kid's movie, is that it teaches us that there is a difference between immature faith and mature faith. And immature faith will only celebrate the faithfulness of God and attempt to eliminate the betrayals of God. But mature faith includes both the stories of God's faithfulness and God's betrayals. And wouldn't it be more convenient if we only had to talk about the faithfulness of God? Yes. But I've found that sometimes when we do the right thing, it doesn't come back and help us win. Instead, it often causes us to lose. I want to close today by telling you a story where I felt betrayed by God, even though I was a secondary character in this story. The story I want to tell you is a story about a woman named Bethany. Now, before we go any further, I need you to know that Bethany is not her real name, and I also need you to know that I have expressed permission from Bethany to share this story with you this morning. Now, Bethany was dating a man named Alan. Now, Alan is not his real name either, and they were both students at a place that we'll just call the university. It was a college, but we'll just refer to it as the university, okay? Alan and Bethany broke up in September of 2018. I'm going to read to you a letter that I wrote to the university on May 10, 2019, 7.5 months after the breakup occurred. I'm doing this because this is one of those stories where I don't think I helped the situation. It's not my best professional moment. And the only way I can categorize this story is by using terms like, this felt like a betrayal by God. And it's really hard to talk about this morning, and I understand that, but at the same time, This is what Lamentations 2 is. And so I want to share with you a letter I wrote on behalf of Bethany to the university because it explains how this all came into being and shares the story. To whom it may concern at the university, my name is Craig Hadley, and I am Bethany's pastor. Last September, Bethany made a counseling appointment with me, and during our counseling session, she informed me that her boyfriend, Alan, and her broke up the night before. She was heavy-hearted. Through tears, she recounted the story of their breakup to me, and as she neared the end, she told me that Alan threatened to kill himself unless Bethany stayed with him. My heart stopped upon hearing this harrowing ultimatum. I immediately advised Bethany to inform the university of Alan's suicidal threat. I did this because there are only two possible outcomes when Alan threatens suicide to Bethany. The first outcome is that Alan is serious. Alan is ready to kill himself, and the university needs to intervene and help him immediately. The second reason he might be doing this is because he's malicious. He isn't suicidal, but instead he is attempting to saddle Bethany with overwhelming guilt to coerce her to stay in a romantic relationship. This coercion is abuse. After some thought, Bethany did as I advised, and she informed the university of Alan's threat. In return, the university completely failed Bethany for the past 7 months and counting in 3 big ways. The first way, Alan has continued to aggressively harass and stalk Bethany. He has attempted to contact her via phone calls, text messages, Instagram, Facebook, and even Venmo. He has threatened her by saying that he will show up to her workplace. He has waited outside of her classes, and he has hopped over a fence to get to her apartment window after midnight 2 times. Bethany informed the university that Alan was stalking her, and the university did not believe her. It was not until Bethany's RA witnessed Alan hopping a fence after midnight the second time that the university finally believed Bethany's account. It was only after this witness that the university finally placed a restraining order on campus on Alan 7 months after the initial abuse was filed. Number 2, after Bethany reported Alan's suicidal threat, the university opened an investigation where they sided with Alan. Alan denied the suicidal threat even though he was stalking Bethany at the time. In response, the board overseeing the investigation called Bethany in and informed her that they did not believe her account of the story and that they believed that Alan never threatened suicide. To make matters worse, the university accused Bethany of lying, suggesting she made up the suicidal threat to get revenge against Alan after their breakup. Number 3, today, May 10, 2019, Bethany is being asked to tell her story again, from the beginning, including details of her and Alan's breakup, the suicidal threat, and all of the terrible moments of harassment. When Bethany first reported her story to the university, she was frustrated by the fact that the person who heard her story did not write anything down. A few days later, that person called Bethany back into their office and asked her to relive the story again so that this time they could write it down. Since that time, Bethany has told her story more than 6 times to different boards and different officials. Most of these boards and officials have promised Bethany that this will be the last time she will have to tell her story. And then they promise that this board or this official is finally going to take her story seriously. So here we are, once again, on May 10, with another board telling Bethany that this 9th time of her sharing her story will be the time that her story is finally taken seriously and that she will not have to tell it again. Bethany's story has shone a light on the university's ineptitude in dealing with abuse. Alan's actions toward Bethany have been destructive since September 2018, and the university is finally getting around to doing something about it in May of 2019. The main purpose of my writing is to ask the university to fully review and implement radical changes in the way they treat survivors of abuse. The Office of Student Life must be better equipped to be sympathetic to people who are experiencing pain. Staff from the highest level on downward should be taught to never accuse a survivor like Bethany of making up suicidal threats. Lastly, the university must recognize that they have been complicit in Alan's behavior by allowing him to stalk and harass Bethany for so long before finally taking action. I do not suggest this complicity lightly. To demonstrate how the university has enabled the bad behavior of Alan, you do not need to look further than today's meeting with Bethany. This meeting today was originally scheduled for May 2. Today is May 10. The university informed Bethany that this meeting needed to be postponed 8 days so that someone with more experience could handle her case. In that delay, Alan showed up to a church Bethany was worshiping at and attempted to confront her in person. This resulted in Bethany going to the courts and acquiring a restraining order on May 6. That frightening moment, and all of the frightening moments of harassment and stalking before this one, could have been avoided if the university decided to act swiftly against the initial abuse of coercion. Please, look at Bethany's story as an opportunity to make things right, to make sure that something like this will never happen again, and to make this university a better place to be a student. Sincerely, Craig Hadley. I know that's a difficult story to speak of in church. It was a difficult process to watch somebody you care about go through it, and it was very difficult for her to live through all of it. You may be wondering this morning, why isn't the pastor just telling us a happy story so we can go home feeling good? I think there are 3 reasons why we need to tell this story. And these 3 reasons revolve around the importance of understanding that this story actually took place. I know it's inconvenient, I know it makes us uncomfortable, but we have to acknowledge that Bethany's story is real. This is a betrayal by God. It would be nice if there was an intervention that made this all right, but it's here for us. This story is real. And while you may or may not know Bethany, you have your own stories where you've done the right thing and you've ended up losing because of it. My friends, the betrayal by God happens to people of faith. And while we like to pretend it doesn't happen, we must acknowledge and accept that it is part of every spiritual journey. The first reason we're telling this story is because Bethany's story is real. The second reason is that every one of us here can do something upon hearing Bethany's story. All of us here have either a workplace or a school or a family. And in those places, there are systems in place for what happens when abuse occurs. And if you have not read stories of women who have reported on bad behavior by men, then read more stories, because it is not a pleasant experience at all to go through that. On top of the abuse by the abuser, there is the systemic neglect from the overarching system that needs to change, that begins with us. Wherever you work, you can make changes to make it so it's more conducive for people like Bethany. It's more friendly, it's more humane. Maybe you're just a student at your school. There are things that you can do to make sure that this story doesn't happen again. Every one of us here can do something in response to Bethany's story. Which brings us to the third reason I tell you the story. I don't know if I gave Bethany good advice. I really believed the university would care, and they didn't. And she went through hell on earth, and I may have caused that. I really thought that we could help the situation. I thought we could help Alan, but she ended up having to pay the price on the advice that I gave her. It's tough. I don't know if I gave her the right advice. But you know what I do know? I am 100% convinced that Bethany did the right thing. I'm 100% convinced that she did the right thing in reporting this abuse and sharing that. I'm convinced of this because if there's a chance that she is listening today, I just want you to know that you have inspired me. And we've talked before, we've talked several times. We don't know if it was the right move to do, but at the same time, I know your heart was in the right place, and I want to encourage you as you are still dealing with the fallout from this. And if any of you have done the right thing and paid the price, I want you to know you are not alone. Your pastor has done the same thing. The person next to you has most likely at some point lived through the same experience. The betrayals by God are inconvenient, but they are real. And may we all recognize that we are not alone. My friends, may we see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, in both God's faithfulness and in God's betrayal.